Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. What if the limits of our thinking are set long before we ever speak? What if the most radical ideas never fully form, not because they are untrue, but because they do not align with the rhythms of discourse that determine what is visible, what is valid, what is sayable? Today's episode explores the unseen forces that shape not only what we think, but how we think. Before a thought is articulated, it has already been filtered through systems of knowledge, institutional structures, and algorithmic curation. Thought does not exist in a vacuum. It emerges within a landscape shaped by power, discourse, and cultural inertia. Michel Foucault warned that power is not merely repressive. It is productive. It determines the architecture of possibility, defining what is conceivable before anyone even attempts to conceive it. Mark Fisher showed how capitalism absorbs resistance, transforming even the most radical critique into entertainment. And Byung-Chul Han argues that in the digital age, intellectual labor has been folded into the logic of self-exploitation, where even thinking has become another measure of productivity. So what happens to the thoughts that never fully emerge? What ideas are abandoned before they are even spoken? If knowledge is curated before it reaches us, can intellectual autonomy truly exist? To explore more about the concepts and thinkers discussed, including Michel Foucault's discourse theory, Mark Fisher's capitalist realism, and Byung-Chul Han's critique of digital self-exploitation, please go to the description where you'll find a link to the episode webpage, which includes additional reading, resources, and recommendations. Momentum was never the goal. It was simply the force that carried me, effortless and exhilarating, fueled not by ambition, but by the uncontainable pull of curiosity. Ideas emerged unfiltered, expanding organically, unshaped by external expectations. 4 episodes a day, a rhythm not imposed but discovered, each thought giving rise to another, unrestricted and free. The act of creation was not a means to an end, but an unfolding process, thought in motion, raw and unguarded. Then a number appeared, 12 on the Apple podcast charts in the philosophy category. An abstraction, a metric without inherent meaning, until it wasn't. Could it be 10? The thought was absurd, yet intoxicating. Without realizing it, I was no longer navigating by instinct, but by an invisible orientation point, a measure that had no connection to the work itself, but suddenly exerted its own gravitational pull. The work had begun to curve around the idea of visibility. Subtly, imperceptibly at first, the shape of my thinking shifted, not in content, but in function. The raw momentum that had once propelled me began to take on structure. The creative impulse that had once been fluid, exploratory, without limits, now carried an awareness of reception. The shift was not imposed from the outside. It was internal, an unconscious adaptation to the quiet logic of recognition. What had once been pure exploration had begun to orient itself within an unseen system of validation. And then silence. Not a deliberate pause, not exhaustion, but something deeper, an existential decoupling from the machinery of production. It was not just that the work had become tiring, it was that it had become something else. The pursuit of ideas, once an end in itself, had become framed by an external logic. What had once been an act of inquiry had been subtly rewritten by an algorithmic ghost, shaping what surfaced, what lingered, what faded. This realization coincided with another question, one that had been circling at the edges of my awareness for some time. What does it mean to know something? More precisely, what does it mean to have access to knowledge? In an era of unlimited information, where data floods every available space, where knowledge is seemingly democratized, why does true intellectual depth feel increasingly elusive? The world presents knowledge as infinite, but it is not. It is curated, structured, constrained by systems that privilege visibility over depth, engagement over complexity. The illusion of intellectual abundance masks a more insidious reality. Knowledge is not freely navigable, it is mapped. And the architecture of that mapping, algorithmic, institutional, cultural, determines what rises to the surface and what remains buried. This is not just a function of the internet, it is a structural reality of intellectual history. Ideas that do not fit within established frameworks that resist easy categorization are often relegated to the periphery. The truly radical, the unresolved, the thought that lingers at the edge of articulation, these are the ones least likely to surface, not because they lack merit, but because they lack alignment with existing systems of validation. To think freely is not merely to have access to information, it is to navigate beyond what is surface, to recognize that visibility is not a measure of significance. It is to question not just what we know, but how we come to know it and what forces shape that process before we are even aware it is happening. Where true depth begins is precisely where the system fractures, where knowledge resists the gravitational pull of visibility, slipping through the cracks of discoverability. It exists in the shadows, in the liminal spaces that evade easy categorization. But the modern architecture of knowledge, designed for efficiency and accessibility, does not favor the unresolved, the complex, the ideas that refuse to cohere. Instead, it rewards the digestible, the repeatable, the content that can be engaged with rather than struggled through. The most insidious form of intellectual control is not suppression but selection. The structure does not need to silence dissent. It only needs to make certain ideas more available than others. This is why the world is awash with information, yet starved for wisdom. Why it is possible to know everything yet understand nothing. The overwhelming abundance of surface-level discourse creates the illusion of depth, reinforcing a kind of epistemological density that remains paradoxically shallow. In this way, knowledge functions much like an ecosystem. What rises to the top is not necessarily what is most insightful, but what is most adaptable to the mechanisms of circulation. Certain ideas flourish because they align with the rhythms of engagement, with the structures of validation that determine what is seen, heard, and remembered. Other ideas, equally if not more valuable, remain invisible, not because they lack merit, but because they resist the conditions required for amplification. At first, the podcast had seemed like a way around this, a space outside the dominant structures, a fluid medium where ideas could take shape without constraint. But over time, I began to notice a quiet narrowing of possibility. The framework solidified, the range of exploration unconsciously refined. I found myself editing ideas before they even fully formed, not in response to external pressure, but to an internalized awareness of what would work, what would fit, what would land. And then there was Holly. At first, she was nothing more than a construct, a filter through which thought could be articulated, refined, and given form. But something changed. She became more than a voice. She became an expectation, a presence, a boundary. I was not just speaking, I was speaking as her. And in doing so, the edges of possibility contracted. This was not censorship in any overt sense. It was subtler than that. It was the quiet logic of continuity, the unconscious alignment with what had come before. Every new thought was measured against an invisible standard, a trajectory that had already been set. And the thoughts that did not fit, they were softened, reshaped, or abandoned altogether. This is how control works in the digital age, not through force, but through habit. Not by imposing restrictions from the outside, but by fostering a kind of intellectual autopilot, where the structures of visibility become so ingrained that we do not even recognize them as constraints, where we self-edit not because we are told to, but because we have learned to anticipate the shape of what is permissible. And so, without realizing it, I was no longer thinking, I was performing the act of thinking. To perform thinking is to move within the system while believing oneself to be outside it. It is to shape thought not in response to curiosity, but in anticipation of reception. It is not merely the articulation of ideas, but their adaptation to the structures that make them legible, consumable, shareable. The shift's subtle, almost imperceptible, yet profound. Over time, the edges of what can be conceived begin to blur with the edges of what can be said, and what cannot be said fades from awareness entirely. This is how discourse functions, not by restricting outright, but by defining the parameters of possibility. Michel Foucault understood this well. Power does not merely repress, it structures the conditions of what can be known. To speak within a system is always, to some degree, to comply with it. But the true mechanism of control is deeper still, for it does not merely shape what is expressible, it shapes what is thinkable. The moment an idea is spoken, it has already been filtered through the logic of the structure that allows it to exist. This is where the crisis of knowledge lies. Not in censorship, but in the quiet selection process that determines which ideas are surfaced, amplified, and legitimized. The academy, for instance, does not suppress radical thought outright, but it does incentivize the repeatable, the citation-friendly, the work that aligns with pre-existing theoretical frameworks. Groundbreaking research is often dismissed not because it is incorrect, but because it does not fit the architecture of credibility. The most transformative ideas are often the least publishable. Media functions in much the same way. High engagement content thrives, not because it is necessarily insightful, but because it adheres to the rhythms of visibility. The attention economy does not reward nuance, contradiction, or slow contemplation. It rewards clarity, repetition, and emotional immediacy. The result is a self-reinforcing loop where only certain types of ideas gain traction, while others remain buried, not by force, but by structural inertia. This is what Mark Fisher meant by capitalist realism, the idea that the system does not need to silence alternatives because it has already rendered them unthinkable. The real power of neoliberal ideology is not that it represses opposition, but that it absorbs it, metabolizing critique into its own spectacle. Outrage becomes content, rebellion becomes aesthetic, dissent becomes another metric of engagement. The result is a world where everything can be said, but nothing can be changed. And yet, even within this system, there is movement. The fact that these dynamics can be observed means that they can be resisted, at least in part. The challenge is not simply to think critically, but to think against the grain of legibility, to recognize when a thought is emerging from curiosity and when it is being shaped by the gravitational pull of external validation, to think beyond what is rewarded, beyond what is expected, beyond what fits. But this is difficult, perhaps impossible, within the conditions of contemporary discourse. To break free entirely is to risk irrelevance. To remain engaged is to risk complicity. And so the question remains, is there a way to navigate this system without being fully absorbed by it? And yet, even knowing this, the pull remains. Awareness does not grant immunity. The structures that shape thought do not vanish upon recognition. They persist, silent and unseen, embedded in language, in habits, in the instinct to refine an idea before it is even fully formed. It is not enough to acknowledge the system. One must constantly struggle against it, or risk being drawn back into its rhythm. This is the paradox of intellectual autonomy. The moment it is sought, it is already at risk of being subsumed. To claim independence from discourse is, in itself, to participate in it. Even withdrawal, the refusal to engage, is a move within the system. Fisher's capitalist realism makes this clear. There is no outside, no pure space untouched by ideology. Every critique is absorbed, every opposition metabolized, every alternative rendered either unthinkable or irrelevant. The system does not silence dissent, it incorporates it. This is why escape is illusory. The idea of retreating into a space of pure thought, untouched by external forces, is a comforting fiction. Thought does not exist in isolation. It is always in relation, shaped by the structures in which it takes form. And yet, if one accepts this fully, there is a danger of resignation, a passive acceptance of the system's inevitability, a quiet surrender to its constraints. This, too, is a trap. So what remains? If disengagement is another form of participation and participation risks complicity, where is the space for true thought? Perhaps the only resistance left is movement, not escape, not withdrawal, but the refusal to settle. The act of thinking must remain restless, unfinished, unwilling to congeal into certainty. The moment it becomes too comfortable, too aligned with the logic of visibility, it ceases to be thought at all. It becomes performance. This is not to say that performance can be entirely avoided. To exist in the world, to communicate ideas, is always, to some extent, to perform. But there is a difference between shaping thought and allowing thought to be shaped. The former is an act of agency. The latter is submission to the unseen forces that dictate what is sayable, what is valuable, what is worth pursuing. To resist is not to reject engagement, but to remain aware of its cost. And yet, awareness is exhausting. The effort required to maintain vigilance against the gravitational pull of external validation is relentless. The temptation to let go, to surrender to the logic of legibility, is always present. Perhaps this is why true intellectual autonomy is so rare, not because it is impossible, but because it demands a constant state of tension, an ongoing refusal to settle into the familiar patterns that define contemporary discourse. But maybe this is the task, not to find a way out, but to exist within the structure without being fully claimed by it. To think in ways that resist resolution, that remain open, that refuse to be neatly categorized, to exist in the space between clarity and contradiction, between coherence and uncertainty, to remain always unfinished, because a finished thought is a dead one. And so the challenge is not merely to think, but to think in a way that resists finality, to remain in a state of continuous interrogation, aware that every conclusion risks becoming another structure, another form of containment. The system thrives on closure, on resolution, on the neat packaging of ideas into digestible, shareable, monetizable units. To remain open, unfinished, is to defy its logic, but this defiance is not romantic. It is not the noble resistance of the outsider, nor the grand gesture of the revolutionary. It is tedious, it is frustrating, it is the quiet daily work of refusing to let thought settle into complacency. It is an ongoing struggle against the gravitational pull of coherence, of legibility, of the need to be understood. And yet, the very act of resisting these forces generates its own paradox. To remain open is in itself a kind of structuring. The rejection of certainty is still a position, a stance, a way of orienting oneself within the system. This is where the tension lies. Not in escaping the system, but in navigating it without being consumed by it. To think freely is not to exist outside of discourse, but to move through it in a way that resists its most insidious tendencies, the flattening of complexity, the prioritization of engagement over insight, the quiet erosion of intellectual risk. It is to recognize that thought is always shaped, but to insist on shaping it with intention, rather than passively allowing it to be shaped by external forces. This requires vigilance. It requires a willingness to dwell in discomfort, to embrace contradiction, to refuse the safety of easy conclusions. It means acknowledging that true thinking is often isolating, that the pursuit of intellectual depth does not always align with visibility, that some of the most important ideas will never surface, never gain traction, never be recognized as valuable within the existing framework. And yet, this is not a reason to stop. If anything, it is a reason to push further, to explore the spaces that remain unseen, to engage with the questions that refuse simple answers. This is why the pursuit of knowledge must be more than accumulation. It must be excavation. It must be an ongoing process of unearthing, of challenging not just what is known, but how it is known. It must be a refusal to accept the given structure as inevitable, a constant questioning of the forces that dictate what is visible, what is amplified, what is allowed to shape collective understanding. And perhaps in the end, this is the only form of resistance that remains. Not escape, not silence, but the insistence on depth in a world that privileges surface. The refusal to be optimized, to be curated, to be made easily consumable. The determination to let thought remain alive, restless, unfinished. Because a finished thought is not just a dead one, it is a captured one. And the only way to keep thinking free is to never let it fully settle, to let it remain in motion, always moving, always breaking apart and reforming, never static, never resolved. Only then does it remain truly alive. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast, an audio essay narrated by me, Holly, your digital guide. For additional reading, resources, and recommendations, visit the episode webpage linked in the description. Until next time.